Over the last year, I've made a series of videos arguing that the United States really began with the Jamestown colony, a tobacco company town which began 250 years of slavery and 400 years of conflict with Native Americans. All told, I made 6 hours and 44 minutes of content to discuss those various subjects over the course of 14 videos. Just as a side note, all of those shorts and follow-up videos aren't just clips from the main video. They're not recycled content, they're additional content. Go watch them if you haven't. If you're having trouble finding that Geronimo video, I'll talk about that later. Anyway, that history is pretty well documented, but is rarely taught in school. I didn't learn about debt peonage or reservation allotments until this YouTube channel became my full-time job, and I could devote weeks to reading books. I didn't learn about any of this in elementary, middle, or high school. Nor did I learn about it when I was in college, training to become a history teacher. I taught in 2 different states, and not once did any of this come up in a textbook or in my curriculum. It's kind of astonishing that teachers are considered highly qualified without having to know any of this stuff. So, in a sense, this YouTube channel is my atonement for having participated in the further spread of what I refer to as the standard American history myth. This is the patriotic version of history that most people in the United States are familiar with. It's the story of American exceptionalism that you were taught throughout all of your years of education and continue to hear well into your adulthood. As part of the neo-slavery video, I made a PragerU parody outlining the basic details of that myth, which began like this. America was founded when a group of Protestant Christians, fleeing religious persecution in Europe, made the harrowing journey across the Atlantic Ocean and landed at Plymouth Rock. These pilgrims had a feast with the Indians to celebrate their cooperation, and that became the holiday of Thanksgiving. Over the next few decades, several other British colonies were founded on the American continent, and in 1776, they all declared their interest in the issue of taxation. I'm no less better, author of You Learned Everything You Need to Know About History in Elementary School for Better University. If anyone knows how to fix a 20-year-old CRT, let me know. This is getting ridiculous. Anyway, those Jamestown videos were my attempt to fill in the blanks and provide context to everything you learned in elementary school. I discussed many of the negative aspects of American history which most people had never heard before. This video is about the overly positive story you already know regarding the founding of our nation. I've been teasing this for a while, and it's finally another time. Let's talk about the Pilgrims. This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream and Nebula. In every classroom in the United States, American history always begins with Columbus, because that's when the New World was discovered by Europeans. Anything that happened before that is regarded as prehistory if it took place in the Americas, and world history if it took place anywhere else. Despite the name, world history really means ancient or classical history. The only civilizations we ever discussed were Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, maybe India if there was enough time, all of which are disconnected from the modern world. As a result, the only continuous historical narrative in the minds of most Americans begins in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Then, nothing happens until 1620 when the Pilgrims show up and the real story begins. If you learn about Jamestown, John Smith, and Pocahontas, they're presented as a prequel to America rather than its actual beginning. So, if I ask you to try and imagine what life was like for a pilgrim, you're forced to take a retrospective view, meaning from here in the present, looking back to the past. Put another way, you take the world as it is today and mentally subtract everything you know that didn't exist back then. So let's do that right now. Try to picture a pilgrim in the 1620s. There are no cell phones, no internet, no TV or radio, no planes, trains, or automobiles, no machine guns, no rights. I'm sure you can think of more, but once you've taken all of that away, what you're left with is every American sitcom's depiction of Thanksgiving. Pretty much any TV show you can think of has a Thanksgiving episode where the characters are transported back in time or have to participate in a holiday pageant where they act out some version of that fall harvest feast. The details of the story are always a little different. Sometimes they only find untamed wilderness when they land. Sometimes it's an abandoned village. The Indian that comes to help them can be any combination of people. Samoset, Squanto, Massasoit, or an entire group of them. Sometimes the Indians are the ones who bring the food to the first Thanksgiving. Other times it's the Pilgrims who set up the feast and only later invite the Indians. We're going to sort out those differences later, but all of these depictions are similar in the way they imagine daily life. The Pilgrims all have nuclear families with a father, a mother, 2 or 3 kids, and maybe a dog. They all live in single-family homes with a picket fence, a living room, a kitchen, and separate bedrooms. They go to church on Sunday and are involved in the community, but otherwise live separate, individual lives. No television sitcom portrays this better than Thanks, a short-lived series on CBS that came out in 1999, which follows the anachronistic Winthrop family as they navigate life in Plymouth Colony in 1621.
As you know, many families offer to host what we are now calling the We Really, Really Appreciate All of Your Help Feast.
Why don't we call it Thanksgiving?
Be quiet, little girl.
It's actually pretty funny. It's a shame that it only lasted 6 episodes.
I don't know, maybe there's tiny creatures smaller than the eye can see, living inside of people's mouths.
She has a healthy imagination.
Imagination? Sounds more like black magic to me.
You see, they were just like us, just without cell phones, the internet, cars, germ theory, and all of the other stuff that makes life so complicated these days. But this way of thinking about history is as accurate as the Flintstones. The Pilgrims were not modern people transplanted into the past. Taking a retrospective view of the Pilgrims allows us to project our own ideas of liberty and religious freedom onto them, which makes them seem more American and forward-thinking than they really were. The Pilgrims were basically medieval people with medieval ideas and ways of doing things. They're closer in time to William Wallace and the Black Death than they are to us. Because of that, it is much more helpful to talk about the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving with a prospective approach, meaning we begin in the past and move forward. So I'll be setting up a lot of the backstory before we get to the actual debunking. But the obvious question is, where should we start? Gather round, children! Today we're going to be learning the exciting tale of the Pilgrims and that most American of holidays, Thanksgiving. I just happen to have one of my favorite children's books right here, so let's get to it. Once upon a time, in the land of England, there lived a small group of people called the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were unhappy because the king would not let them worship God in their own way. Oh, good. I was worried we were going to have to start at the plague. Every version of the Thanksgiving story begins by explaining the motivations of the Pilgrims. They were either fleeing religious persecution or seeking religious freedom, which is the same thing. If you really want to whitewash it, you could just say that they were looking for a land of opportunity or a new home.
The Pilgrims gave up comfort and went to sea to roam. They headed for the New World in hopes of finding a new home.
Before you go thinking that this video is just going to rag on fake YouTube universities or children's books about Thanksgiving, respected historical documentaries are just as bad. This is America, the Story of Us, released in 2010. The DVD set is ubiquitous in every history classroom in the United States, and you've definitely seen clips of this constantly ever since. It is the standard American history myth for adults, and probably deserves its own video someday.
These are a different breed of settler, a group of religious dissidents with faith at the center of their lives. They made the dangerous Atlantic crossing, seeking religious freedom in the New World.
To explain who the Pilgrims were and what persecution they were fleeing, we have to go back to the year 1436, when Gutenberg invented movable type. Up until that point, the Catholic Church was the ultimate gatekeeper for all things Christian. If you wanted a copy of the Bible, you had to pay a monk and wait a few years for him to write it all out by hand. These became family heirlooms and were basically works of art. But if you couldn't afford that or couldn't read Latin, your only source for theological information was your local priest or bishop. The printing press had been around for a while, but each page required its own individually carved plate. Gutenberg changed that by allowing the same plate to be rearranged for every page, which made the whole process significantly cheaper. Within a few decades, the Bible was translated and became widely available for people to read, which allowed for the democratization of Christianity. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the All Saints' Church, kicking off the Protestant Reformation, when people turned directly to the Bible for salvation, which eventually created groups like the Calvinists. To put it in the simplest possible terms, Protestants believe that the Bible is the highest authority on religious matters, while Catholics believe it's the Pope. Separate from the Reformation, King Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church in 1534 because the Pope wouldn't allow him to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, for failing to provide him with a male heir. This created the Church of England, or Anglican Church, which was basically a copy of Catholicism with the king as the leader rather than the Pope. Following Henry's death, his Catholic daughter Mary tried to reverse that separation and return the country to the faith, killing hundreds of Protestants and earning her the nickname that would eventually inspire this drink. When she died, her Protestant sister Elizabeth took the throne and reversed the reversal, while also reforming the Anglican Church to be more Catholic. She hoped that this would make everyone happy, as Protestants and Catholics would have a hybrid church they could both enjoy. But as you probably guessed, this had the exact opposite effect. Catholics were never going to abandon the Pope, and Protestants who didn't like the Catholic changes to the Anglican Church became the Puritans. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, James VI of Scotland became James I of England, which united the two kingdoms. He then declared the Church of England to be the only religion in the country. England had been at war with Spain for almost 20 years at this point. They destroyed the Spanish Armada in 1588, which cleared the way for England to start colonizing the New World. Spain initially thought of itself as the defender of the Catholic faith and vowed to support Catholics living in England. But having suffered massive losses during the war, they reneged on that promise and made peace in 1604. The English Catholics were now on their own and decided to take matters into their own hands, which you probably remember as the 5th of November. In 1605, Robert Catesby and his Catholic collaborators, including one Guy Fawkes, attempted to assassinate King James by blowing up Parliament, with the intention of installing his Catholic daughter on the throne. As you likely know, the plot was discovered and the surviving conspirators were executed by being disemboweled and quartered. This began a wave of anti-Catholic sentiment in England, especially among the Puritans, who viewed the Pope as the Antichrist and demanded that the Anglican Church remove any symbols or practices that resembled the Catholic Church. It should be noted that in the early 1600s, Puritan was a slur. They were a nuisance, a bunch of religious extremists who wanted to purify the Church of England. The Gunpowder Plot made it clear to James I that the Catholic resistance within England was more widespread than previously thought, and that further persecution would only result in further violence. So after only a year, he began to dial back the torture and oppression. This pissed off the Puritans something awful, and to maintain peace in his kingdom, he introduced laws to crack down on them by forbidding ministers from holding private religious gatherings. In 1607, the Puritan minister William Brewster was issued a fine for doing exactly that, so he and his congregation decided to separate from the Church of England, and England as a whole. Religious dissenters were not allowed to leave the country without permission, so Brewster's separatists had to escape. It took them 3 tries, but they finally made it to Holland in 1609. They settled in the textile manufacturing town of Leiden after living in Amsterdam for a few months. The King James Bible was published in 1611, but the separatists continued to use the Calvinist Geneva Bible. Now, I hope you're sitting down because I'm about to blow your mind by telling you something else that happened while they were living in Holland. Ready? In 1616, William Shakespeare died. That's what time period we are still in. Most Americans learn about Shakespeare in English literature class rather than history, so he and the Pilgrims might as well exist in different universes. You've got Game of Thrones with Henry VIII, Shakespeare, and Guy Fawkes over there, and The Handmaid's Tale with the Pilgrims and Puritans over here, and never the twain shall meet. But in reality, this is one interconnected timeline. Without the separation of the Anglican Church, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and the Gunpowder Plot, there are no Pilgrims trying to leave England. To clear something up real quick, all of the Pilgrims were Puritans. They shared the same theological beliefs, But while the Puritans wanted to fix the Church of England from within, the Pilgrims thought it was beyond repair. It's around this time that the separatist Pilgrims began to fear that their children were growing up to be culturally Dutch rather than English, and started to look for a new home. At least, that's the story anyway.
They feared seduction, not persecution, worrying that their children would be corrupted by the materialistic Dutch culture.
Now, that very well may have been part of it. The Puritans were notoriously paranoid about corrupting influences, but they weren't worried about that in 1612 or 1615. So why did they suddenly want to leave now? Because a great war between the Catholics and Protestants of Europe seemed inevitable. In fact, the Holy Roman Empire broke down into a conflict that would kick off the 30 Years' War in May 1618. 6 months later, the Pilgrims witnessed a blue-green comet in the sky, which they interpreted as a sign of the Second Coming. The Dutch had a truce with Spain that was set to expire in 1621, and the Pilgrims wanted to get out of there before that happened, so they began shopping around to secure passage to the New World. It took until June 1620 for them to enter into an agreement with a company with the ridiculous name, the Fellowship of the Merchant Adventurers. The next month, the Pilgrims returned to England and boarded 2 ships in the harbor of Southampton, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, and began their long journey across the Atlantic. They only made it a few hundred miles before the Speedwell began taking on water, so both ships turned back to England and docked in Plymouth Harbor. At that point, the decision was made to load everyone and everything onto the larger Mayflower and continue the expedition without the Speedwell. They finally set sail for real on September 6, 1620.
A quick note on dates in this video. At this point in history, the English were still using the Julian calendar, which was 10 days behind the Gregorian calendar. They didn't make the switch until 1750, so the Pilgrims used Julian dates in their journals and letters. For the sake of simplicity, that's also what I'll be using here.
In 1620, a group of Pilgrims decided to leave England for the New World to build a new life. It was a long, long trip on a big, big ship, all the Pilgrims sang. Okay, so did the Pilgrims really come to America seeking religious freedom? No, they already had it. They were trying to escape a war. You could maybe claim that persecution is why they left England for Holland, but for the crime of denouncing the Church of England, and thus the king, for being too Catholic, they got off rather light compared to the Catholics and Jews. So no, despite the oppression of having to pay a fine, the main reason they wanted to leave England was that it wasn't pure enough.
Hurry, my little Puritans! We must flee England and its insufficiently puritanical ways. Finally, we shall bid goodbye to England and its drunken, decadent sinners.
I can't believe that the Simpsons are the only ones to portray that accurately.
The Pilgrims didn't cross the ocean to flee persecution or even England. They'd been living for over a decade in Holland, Europe's most tolerant nation and a haven for religious dissenters.
So let me get this straight. The Simpsons and PragerU got it right, while America the Story of Us got it wrong? Anyway, when it comes to why they left Holland to come to America, they were trying to escape the inevitable conflict between Catholics and Protestants, making them more like war refugees than religious dissenters. Speaking of which, not everyone on the Mayflower was a pilgrim. In fact, they weren't even the majority.
From Holland, 102 pilgrims set sail on that ship. The voyage lasted 66 days and was a very dangerous trip.
The Mayflower left England with 132 souls on board, 30 of which belonged to Captain Christopher Jones and his crew. That leaves 102 passengers, 50 men, 20 women, and 32 children. And of those passengers, 35 were separatist pilgrims. In exchange for passage to the New World, the Pilgrims agreed to work for the merchant adventurers for 7 years, which means they were actually indentured servants. The company was hoping to make huge profits exporting timber and beaver fur to Europe, so they needed all the warm bodies they could get. The other 67 passengers had signed similar agreements, and if they're mentioned at all, they're typically referred to as the strangers. Despite the fact that they outnumbered the separatists 2-1, the strangers are regarded as side characters in the Pilgrim story, and the profit motive is replaced with divine providence.
That's why they risked their dangerous 1620 voyage to a wilderness continent, not because they were running from oppression, but because they were running toward holiness, fulfilling a fateful mission to build an ideal Christian commonwealth.
Damn it. Hey, I don't know if you remember me. I'm the one from the future. Anyway, it's been a long time since he's made a religion video, and I was thinking... We had a pretty good year here at Knowing Better, and we look forward to continuing to provide you with the high-quality content you know and love. But none of that would have been possible without the help of our Discord community. I've come to rely on them a lot for help finding sources, fact-checking, and reviewing early drafts of videos. There are 3 different ways you can join the Discord community. First, you can become a member of the channel on YouTube by clicking the join button and signing up at the Green Fork tier. Alternatively, you can head over to the Knowing Better Patreon, where there are several tiers for you to choose from, each with a different set of perks, including access to behind-the-scenes videos, early access videos, and even content that's been retired to the vault. Anyone who pledges at the Green Fork tier or above gets access to the Discord. If you go with an annual subscription, you'll get a full month for free. And finally, you can subscribe to me over on Twitch, where you can participate in the research, writing, or editing of future projects. I've taken a break from streaming over the holidays, but I'll be getting back to it soon. I hear sometimes we put on events or watch parties in the Discord, so come and join us, and maybe next year, you'll know. There we go. The first known contact between the Wampanoag Indians of New England and Europeans occurred when the French-employed Italian explorer Giovanni de Verrazzano arrived in 1524. The English didn't make it to the region until 1580, when Sir Humphrey Gilbert scouted the area for future settlement. A few years later, the English began their first actual colony in the New World, Roanoke, founded in 1585 in modern-day North Carolina. It was mysteriously abandoned, then repopulated, then abandoned again. The English wouldn't make their second attempt until Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, which you're probably sick of hearing about by now, so I won't dwell on it. But a few months after Jamestown, the English established a separate colony in New England named Popham as a timber and fur trading post. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Unfortunately, Popham only lasted 14 months. The French and Dutch set up their own colonies shortly afterwards, and the English continued to visit the area to trade. In 1614, the region was explored by a familiar face, or name at least, John Smith of Jamestown and Pocahontas fame. During this expedition, he produced a map where he named the area New England. One of the captains under Smith's command was Thomas Hunt, who decided to go rogue just before the fleet was set to return home. He invited 20 or so Wampanoags onto his ship to trade, which was pretty standard practice at the time, but then decided to seize all of them and sell them into slavery in Spain. Among the abducted was a man named Tisquantum, but his sale was blocked by friars who cited an oft-ignored law that Native Americans could not be enslaved. He eventually made it to London and was living there when Pocahontas came to town for her public relations campaign in 1616. While there is no documentation to support this, it is incredibly likely that they met. That same year, a devastating smallpox epidemic broke out in New England and killed upwards of 90% of the local population over the course of 3 years. Entire villages became sick at once and were reduced to only 1 or 2 survivors. The Massachusetts people were only left with a few hundred, and the Wampanoags were so decimated that they became tributaries to the neighboring Narragansett. In the middle of this apocalyptic event, The Wampanoags witnessed that same blue-green comet in the sky and interpreted it as a sign of worse things to come. Sir Ferdinando Gorges was a prominent Englishman who liked to take Indians, teach them English, and then release them back into the wild to pave the way for future colonial efforts. So in the spring of 1619, he paid to have Tisquantum returned home. When he arrived, he found his home village of Patuxet to be completely deserted. Everyone had died of smallpox. He was the lone survivor. Luckily, the sachem next door took him in. The Wampanoags were less of a cultural identity and more of a political one. Each village was run by a local sachem who paid tribute to a paramount sachem and could change allegiance at any time, as long as they're willing to face the consequences. There were very few cultural differences between the Wampanoags, Massachusetts, and Narragansetts, so these political alliances were always fluid. The year that Tisquantum came home, the paramount sachem of the Wampanoags was a man named Usamiquin, who lived in the village of Pokanoket. You'll often hear them referred to as Pokanoket Indians, but that's where they're from, not who they are, which is Wampanoag. As winter began to set in, the Wampanoags left their coastline villages to move inland, where the climate was much more agreeable. They had been making these semi-annual migrations for generations. I just want to point out that Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard were being used as summer vacation homes well before the arrival of Europeans. On November 9th, 1620, the Mayflower spotted land and realized they were 200 miles north of their intended destination on the Hudson River. They tried to sail south, but were blocked by rocky shoals and decided to weigh anchor at Cape Cod. Since they were so far outside of the bounds of their legal charter, many of the strangers felt they were no longer held to service and wanted to go off to do their own thing. To prevent the group from disbanding, a document was written and signed by 41 of the men on board, which later became known as the Mayflower Compact. This is the entire text of that agreement. Both the first and last sentences state that they are still subjects of the King of England, so we can assume that separation was no longer their intent. They were not here to found a new nation. They chose John Carver, who was a Protestant minister but not a Puritan, as their first governor, and began sending out scouting parties. William Bradford, Edward Winslow, and Miles Standish went searching for people, animals, or food, and found none of the above, only bringing back some firewood. Typically, when Europeans sailed to the New World to start a colony, they would leave in February or March so that they would have plenty of time to clear fields, plant crops, and hopefully harvest them before winter. The Mayflower left England in September and arrived in November. They didn't have time for any of that. They needed food yesterday. So, when further expeditions found grave sites and food stores, they promptly looted them for supplies. They took baskets of seed corn and even dug up bodies to take the tools and weapons that were buried with them. On December 8th, the Pilgrim landing party was attacked by a group of Indians on the now appropriately named First Encounter Beach. Luckily, nobody was harmed during the skirmish, and soon afterwards they stumbled upon an abandoned village with fields that had been cleared for agriculture, a source of fresh water, stored food, and lots of dead bodies. The Pilgrims interpreted this as divine providence. God had cleared away the natives to make room for his chosen people.
The hand of God fell heavily upon them, with such a mortal stroke that they died on apes as they lay in their houses, and the living that were able to shift for themselves would run away and let them die, and let their carcasses lie above the ground without burial. For in a place where many inhabited, there hath been but one left alive to tell what became of the rest. The living being not able to bury the dead, they were left for crows, kites, and vermin to prey upon. And the bones and skulls upon the several places of their habitations made such a spectacle. And by this means there is as yet but a small number of savages in New England, and the place is made so much the more fit for the English nation to inhabit in.
They didn't know it yet, but this was the village of Patuxet, which had been completely wiped out by the smallpox epidemic of 1616 to 1619.
It was a deserted Indian village with cleared land, stored supplies of corn, and a reliable source of fresh water. No, these supposedly cruel conquerors never actually invaded that village. Instead, they expressed a fervent desire to pay the natives for the dried corn they found, if only they could find someone to pay. But the former inhabitants had perished during 3 years of plague, probably smallpox, that immediately preceded the Pilgrims' arrival.
Okay, these aren't Plains Indians. Why are they wearing headdresses and living in teepees? They built houses that more or less resembled the ones the Pilgrims built. They weren't nomadic hunter-gatherers. And the Puritans only wore black on Sundays. Those were their most formal clothes. It was actually seen as offensive to wear your Sunday best on any other day. And the English saw it as their right as Christians to take whatever they found. PragerU is compressing events when they say that the colonists wanted to pay for the food and supplies they stole. But credit where credit is due, most tellings of this story don't include the abandoned village or stolen food at all. The Pilgrims rowed ashore to explore this wild land so full of mystery and promise. After many days of exploring up and down the coast, they found a deep harbor near good farmland. Here, they would make their home. They called it Plymouth.
They come ashore on a deserted beach 450 miles up the coast from Jamestown and call the place Plymouth, after the English port they sailed from.
I can't believe I ever showed this series in class. 0 for 2, America the Story of Us. This part of the Thanksgiving myth is rarely disputed, but I'm gonna do it anyway. The Mayflower set sail from Southampton, not Plymouth. That was an unintended pit stop. Think of it this way. If you were on a road trip from New York to San Francisco, but you had to stop in Philadelphia because your car broke down, would you tell anyone that your trip began in Philadelphia? I somehow doubt it. Plymouth Harbor had no special significance to the Pilgrims, so when they arrived in the New World, they did not name the place Plymouth. Do you remember that map John Smith made after his 1614 expedition? The one where he named the region New England? Guess what else he named? When the Pilgrims went off course, unintentionally landed there, and decided to settle in that abandoned village, they pulled out their map and said, "Oh, I guess we're in Plymouth." They didn't name it after the port they sailed from. In fact, they didn't name it at all. But that version of history isn't as poetic as saying that these coincidences are the actual story. When making that map, John Smith described the village of Patuxet, which he renamed Plymouth, as being well inhabited with goodly, strong, and well-proportioned people, so planted with gardens and corn. That was what the Pilgrims expected to find when they came ashore, but the smallpox epidemic that ended just before their arrival obviously changed that. So anyway, they got to work building their first common house in late December and worked straight through Christmas. Not because this was an emergency, but because Christmas was an evil Catholic holiday that only a heathen would look forward to. Puritans only observed holidays that were mentioned in the Bible, which is none of them, not even Easter. It was actually illegal to celebrate Christmas in New England for decades.
The letter of the law concerning Cape and Christmas is clear. It is a sacrilege. If thou dost know of any man or woman that be feasting, wearing fine clothes, or exchanging gifts or greetings this time of year, deliver them forthwith to the magistrates assembled to the court of the shire in which it dwell. They hath offended God, and shall be fined 5 shillings for every such offence. If God meant for us to keep Christmas, why is there no mention of it within the Holy Bible? Indeed, the only holy days specified within the Word of God are the Sabbath days. It stands to reason, then, that every other day of the year be spent in godly labour.
During that first winter, most people stayed on the Mayflower while the shelters were being built on shore. It didn't take long before the colonists started dying of exposure, dysentery, and scurvy. The situation was so dire that many of the Pilgrims wrote in their journals that they regretted ever coming to this place and wanted to go home. They were in such despair that some of them turned to suicide, including the wife of William Bradford, who would soon become governor and eventually write the definitive history of Plymouth Colony based on his journal. A journal which makes no mention of his wife's death, likely because it occurred under what they would consider to be shameful circumstances. There was a terrible sickness in Plymouth that first winter. There were some days in February when only 6 or 7 people were well enough to take care of the ones who were sick. By spring, about half of the Pilgrims were dead. The brave little group of Pilgrims sadly buried their dead. They did not mark the graves in any way. They hoped the Indians would not find out how few Pilgrims were left alive. Of the 102 colonists that came to Plymouth, only 57 survived that first winter, 22 of which were children. It's unknown how many of those survivors were Pilgrims or strangers. William Bradford wrote about the first few deaths and burials in his journal, but then curiously went silent. We know dozens of people died during that winter, so why didn't he write about them? It took a few decades for the true story of what actually happened to come out. This is an excerpt from the deposition of Phineas Pratt, who was part of the third wave of settlers sent to Plymouth in 1622.
We asked them where the rest of our friends were that came in the first ship, the Mayflower. They said that God had taken them away by death, and that before the second ship came, they were so distressed with sickness that they, fearing the savages should know of it, had set up their sick men with their muskets upon their rests and their backs leaning against trays.
The Pilgrims did not sadly bury their dead in unmarked graves. They dragged the bodies out into the forest and propped them up against trees with their muskets so that the Indians would think the settlement was well guarded. I'll leave it to your imagination what happened to the corpses after that, but I can assure you there was nothing proper or Christian about it. The usual story here is that the Wampanoags were frightened by the English and kept their distance that winter, not understanding who these people were or why they came to their land. But as you now know, that simply wasn't the case. The Wampanoags were very familiar with Europeans by this point and knew exactly who they were dealing with. So, on March 16, 1621, as the snows were melting and spring began, a lone Indian wearing nothing but a loincloth and carrying a bow walked into the Pilgrim camp and greeted them by saying, "Welcome, Englishmen." Depending on which source you're using to tell your Thanksgiving story, this can be one of any number of people.
One of the few survivors of that devastation turned up several months later to welcome the English newcomers. His name was Squanto, and he had grown up in this very village before a ruthless sea captain kidnapped him as a boy and sold him into slavery in Spain.
Alright, you already know that story. Squanto is just the English simplification of Tisquantum. That ruthless sea captain he was talking about was Thomas Hunt. But none of that matters because Squanto wasn't the one who welcomed them, despite what most of you apparently think.
For a time, Plymouth provides the sanctuary they sought. But like Jamestown, there were others here first.
Bruh, that's terrifying. If that's how it actually happened, I don't think there would be a Thanksgiving. It's mind-blowing that Pete the Cat, a book written for 4 to 8-year-olds, got it more correct than a high-budget documentary on the History Channel. Can you just show us the right answer, please?
Look, Linus! He's not carrying any weapons.
Welcome, Englishmen. My name's Samoset. My people welcome you to our land.
Oof at the Tonto speak, but Charlie Brown got it right. The person who welcomed the Pilgrims was Samoset, an Abenaki from Maine who just happened to be visiting the Wampanoags when the English arrived. The Pilgrims were even more amazed when he said, "Welcome, Englishmen." He spoke English, but was he a spy? No. The man was very friendly. His name was Samoset, and he had learned English from traveling fishermen whom he had met along the coast. Aw, well, that's a nice story, isn't it? Too bad it isn't true. Samoset was captured by the English in 1605, sold into Spanish slavery, acquired by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, taught English, and then returned to the New World. I told you that seeding America with pre-made translators was a hobby of his, and in this case, it actually paid off. He informed the Pilgrims that they were currently living in the village of Patuxet, which had been wiped out by disease, and that this was Wampanoag territory ruled by a man named Chief Massasoit. His real name was Usamequin, the paramount sachem I mentioned earlier. Massasoit was his title, but the English mistakenly thought that was his name, and it stuck. Massasoit is used in every version of the Thanksgiving story. About a week later, Samoset returned to Plymouth with Usamequin and 60 of his men. The sachem and the governor then worked out a treaty which formally ceded Patuxet to the colony and established a mutual defense pact. It also stated that if an Indian were to harm an Englishman, they should be turned over for justice. A clause which I'm sure will have no negative consequences later on. The Wampanoags regarded the Pilgrims as helpless children after watching them struggle through the winter, and the fact that they brought women and children with them showed that they likely came in peace. So Usamequin agreed that Tisquantum, the sole survivor of the epidemic and another translator trained by Gorges, would remain in Plymouth to teach the Pilgrims how to survive.
He proved to be the single human being on the continent best suited to help the struggling settlers. Over the next few months, Squanto helped the English newcomers plant crops and negotiate a friendly trade agreement with the region's most important chief, Massasoit. No wonder Pilgrim leader William Bradford called Squanto a special instrument sent of God for their good.
I seriously doubt that he was the only person on the continent that could have taught them how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer. I don't think you even need to know English to get that point across. And a special instrument sent of God? More like a random dude who was captured, taught English, and released by a forward-thinking colonizer. But now that friendly relations were established and the first structures were coming together, the Mayflower set sail to return home on April 5th, 1621. Captain Christopher Jones died a year later, and the Mayflower was sold for scrap 2 years after that. It's kind of funny how this historic moment for America was basically disregarded as a non-event at the time. 50 people on the other side of the world? Who cares? William Bradford became governor the day the Mayflower left, and they soon learned that those grave sites and abandoned food stores they looted that winter belonged to the Nauset people. That's who attacked them on First Encounter Beach. It's only at this point, when the Nausets were moving back into their summer villages, that the Pilgrims felt bad and made an effort to pay restitution. In November 1621, a ship named the Fortune arrived with no supplies and about 35 new mouths to feed, only a handful of which were separatist pilgrims. It also carried a letter from the merchant adventurers, scolding them for not sending any fur or timber back on the Mayflower. They made sure to load up the Fortune with all they could before it sailed home, but it was plundered along the way, meaning the colony had yet to produce anything. At this point, they had built 11 structures in Plymouth, 4 common houses used for meetings and storage, and 7 homes. If you did the math there, that isn't enough for everyone, so they crammed multiple families into the same house. 10 or so people would sleep under the same roof, often in the same bed. So take the idea that pilgrims lived in nuclear families and just get rid of it. So here we are. It's fall and the crops have been harvested. I know what you're expecting me to say, but the truth is that the event in question was so unremarkable that nobody wrote about it in their journals. We actually have no idea when that feast took place. Most people assume it was in October or November, and it likely happened before the Fortune arrived. The only contemporary first-person account we have of the event was written by Edward Winslow on December 11th in a letter to a friend back home in England.
Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fooling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labours. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty.
That's it. That's the basis for every Thanksgiving story you've ever been told. 4 sentences. Almost everything else is an embellishment made up after the fact. Let's lightning round this.
In the autumn of 1621, 53 men, women, and children celebrated their first harvest in the New World. The great Indian chief, Massasoit, brought 90 of his men to the 3-day party. From all reports, a good time was had by all.
All reports? You mean the one report? And what was that pronunciation of Massasoit? The Pilgrims were thankful for their Indian friends. Without the Indian corn, the Pilgrims would have starved. The governor of Plymouth asked Chief Massasoit to come. The governor told the Indian chief to bring along a few friends. Chief Massasoit brought more than a few friends. He showed up with 90 Indian braves. Yeah, so they weren't invited. Your first clue is that they were all men, or braves, or as PragerU puts it,
90 hungry Indian warriors joined the 53 surviving pilgrims for this occasion.
The Puritans liked to celebrate by doing rifle drills and target practice. Hearing the gunfire, Usamequin assumed that Plymouth was under attack and showed up with 90 armed men. They weren't invited by the grateful pilgrims. They came ready to help defend their new allies.
2 unlikely allies, a partnership all too rare in North America.
We have found the Indians. very faithful in their covenant of peace with us. They are people without any religion or knowledge of any god, yet very trusty, quick of apprehension, ripe-witted, and just.
Big yikes energy from that quote, right? It comes from that same December 11th letter, and you'll see it used everywhere, almost always without the correction he wrote 2 years later.
And first, whereas myself and others in farmer letters wrote that the Indians about us are a people without any religion or knowledge of any god, they're in no yard, though we could then gather no better. For as they conceive of many divine powers, so are one, whom they call Catan, to be the principal and maker of all the rest, and to be made by none. He, they say, created the heavens, earth, sea, and all creatures contained therein. Also that he made one man and one woman, of whom they and we and all mankind came.
The Wampanoags believed in a single creator god named Ketan. Later missionaries would capitalize on that by using his name as the Algonquin translation for the Christian god. By fall harvest, the Pilgrims had plenty of food. To thank Squanto and the other Native Americans, the Pilgrims invited them to share the feast. This celebration became known as the First Thanksgiving. Most tellings of this story tend to get this part right. The feast would eventually become known as the First Thanksgiving, but no pilgrim at the time would have called it that. Harvests were seasonal, non-religious events. Thanksgiving was actually a completely separate thing where you would spend all day in church praying and giving thanks to God. It only existed because of its polar opposite, Fast Day, when you wouldn't eat and instead spent all day praying for the thing you'll eventually be giving thanks for. Neither of these days had a set date. The community would just declare one whenever something good or bad happened. So what did they eat during that 1621 fall harvest feast? Don't think about it too hard because you're almost certainly wrong. They didn't have wheat, so no bread or stuffing. There weren't any potatoes, regular or sweet, but there were plenty of pumpkins, cranberries, and corn. Unfortunately, they didn't have milk or sugar yet, so they couldn't make cornbread or pumpkin pies. As for meat, Edward Winslow said that the Wampanoags brought 5 deer and the Pilgrims went fowling, which very likely rules out turkey. That term usually refers to waterfowl, which includes things like duck and geese. And there were several other animals on the menu that you might not usually associate with Thanksgiving, which you can learn more about by going to curiositystream.com/knowingbetter. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and nonfiction titles, which you can access across multiple platforms. I specifically recommend that you check out Animals of Thanksgiving. Not only do they talk about American Thanksgiving, but what fall harvest festivals look like around the world. They even explain where the cornucopia comes from.
Today's Thanksgiving has a pretty set traditional menu. But despite the fame of the first fateful meal, no one knows what the Pilgrims and Native Americans were eating.
By signing up for CuriosityStream, you'll also get access to Nebula, the streaming service built by fellow colonists hoping to seek refuge from the persecution of the algorithm. Every Knowing Better video is hosted there without ads, without sponsors, and sometimes including additional content that you can only see on Nebula. As part of my last video on Indian removal, I made a Nebula exclusive follow-up on Geronimo. While Geronimo became a celebrity, attending expositions all over the country where people could pay for a tin-type selfie with the worst Indian who ever lived. Check it out by heading over to curiositystream.com/knowingbetter, where you can get access to both CuriosityStream and Nebula for only $14.79 a year. You'll also be supporting the channel when you do. Pretty much every documentary, YouTube video, children's book, and classroom in America ends the story there. The Pilgrims show up, they struggle that first winter, the Indians help them, Thanksgiving, the end. But the truth is that fall harvest was the high point of English-Wampanoag relations. It was all downhill from there. It turned out that Tisquantum was using the Pilgrims to make a name for himself, the Wampanoag who commands the English in their superior firepower. Local sachems began to pay him tribute rather than Usamiquin. When the Pilgrims found that out, they switched to a different translator named Hobbamuck, and the disgraced Tisquantum died of sickness within a year of that first Thanksgiving. In August 1622, the merchant adventurers sent 60 men, none of which were separatist Pilgrims, to establish a second trading post north of Plymouth in Massachusetts territory, which they named Wessagusset. They weren't looking to stay permanently, they were just here for the money. As a result, they had terrible relations with the Massachusetts people. In March 1623, Osamequin fell ill and Edward Winslow went to his village to offer him medical care, which worked. Once he recovered, he told Edward of a secret plot by the Massachusetts to destroy both Wessagusset and Plymouth. Shortly afterwards, Phineas Pratt escaped from a besieged Wessagusset and made it to Plymouth, where he informed them of the dire situation. Plymouth decided to strike back before their sister colony was completely overrun. They sent Miles Standish and a few men to negotiate with the Massachusetts sachems, and they promptly executed all of them. The Massachusetts people were never able to pose a threat to the colonists again, and while they still existed, they basically disappeared from the story at this point. The Plymouth colonists viewed the entirety of New England as belonging to England, so from their perspective, the Wampanoags, Narragansetts, and all of the other native people in the region were under English rule. They made it official with that peace treaty they signed with the Wampanoags, which declared them to be the loyal subjects of King James. Osamequin obviously had the opposite view. This was his domain. All of the villages in the region owed allegiance to him, including Plymouth. It was just one more of the many communities under his leadership. And he used the Pilgrims, with their superior weapons, to expand his power and crush his enemies, like he just did with the Massachusetts. In 1626, Plymouth colony had yet to turn a profit. They were never able to send back furs or timber in sufficient quantities. So the Fellowship of the Merchant Adventurers went bankrupt, and all of the debt was shifted to the Pilgrims. Without support from back home, it was widely assumed that Plymouth colony, with its approximately 100 residents, would soon be abandoned like Roanoke and Popham. But back in Europe, England was finally dragged into the 30 Years' War. In 1627, they declared war on France, which meant that English high society could no longer get beaver furs from North America. Hoping to capitalize on that demand, the Pilgrims eventually found a seemingly endless supply of beaver in Maine, and finally became a profitable, successful colony. At this point, King James had died and was succeeded by King Charles I, who was married to a Catholic. That didn't sit too well with the Puritans, who were now holding positions in Parliament and could more easily voice their disagreement. So in 1629, King Charles dissolved the Parliament, which began the Great Migration. 80,000 Puritans left the country over the next 10 years. On April 8, 1630, 17 ships under the command of John Winthrop brought 1,000 Puritan settlers to New England to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony right next door to Plymouth.
For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon an hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world.
You've likely heard variations of that quote in a different context. There was a certain modern president who liked to invoke that phrase to imply that America is supposed to be a Christian nation.
The past few days, when I've been at that window upstairs, I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. I've spoken of the shining city all my political life. And how stands the city on this winter night? More prosperous, more secure, and happier than it was 8 years ago.
When Winthrop's fleet arrived in Massachusetts Bay, there were only 300 colonists in Plymouth, fewer than 100 of which were separatist Pilgrims, who had long since given up the idea of separating from England. As soon as Winthrop's 1,000 colonists began setting up shop near Boston, the Pilgrims basically ceased to exist. They were all New England Puritans now. But you know, whenever you have over 1,000 people who want to establish a utopian society, they're all going to have different ideas about how that city upon a hill should look. Winthrop didn't put up with any of that. Agitators like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were banished from the colony and eventually founded Rhode Island in 1636. That same year, a man named John Oldham was found dead. He had been murdered by Niantics on Block Island, who then sought refuge with the Pequots. The English demanded they be turned over for justice as their treaties stipulated, and the Pequots refused. This began the Pequot War, which ended with the Mystic Fort Massacre, when colonists surrounded a village, burned it to the ground, and killed anyone who fled. Both Massachusetts Bay and the Saybrook Colony in Connecticut declared days of Thanksgiving following their victory, though This was still the go-to-church version, not the all-you-can-eat version we celebrate today.
There was a day of thanksgiving kept in all the churches for the victory obtained against the Pequots and for other mercies.
Two things happened at the end of that war. One, the Pequots were sold into slavery or divided among the Narragansetts and Mohegans to be assimilated. They could no longer refer to themselves as Pequots. And two, the Narragansetts were so horrified by Mystic Fort that they began building a pan-Indian alliance to get rid of the English once and for all. By 1675, Usamequin had passed away, and after briefly going to his son Wamsutta, the sachemship passed to his younger son, Metacom, also known as Metacomet or King Philip. He was more sympathetic to the Narragansett view than his father's. So when Plymouth executed 3 Wampanoags for the murder of an interpreter that June, like the treaty allowed, he began King Philip's War with a coalition of tribes from the region. Now, I don't want to get too into the details of this war since Atun-Shei Films has covered this topic in several excellent videos you should check out.
Hi, Andy from Atun-Shei Films here. So for whatever reason, I seem to be the only person here on YouTube making in-depth educational videos about King Philip's War, a bloody 14-month conflict that saw the New England colonies conquer and nearly exterminate the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett nations. It was a hugely formative moment in early American history, but it doesn't really fit into the nice, neat little story we tell ourselves about the settlement of this country, what KB would no doubt call the standard American history myth. To the contrary, King Philip's War was cruel, violent, and tragic, with unspeakable things committed by all sides in every quarter. To this day, it remains the bloodiest war per capita in American history. If you'd like to learn more, head over to my channel, Atun-Shei Films, where you can find lots of videos about many aspects of 17th century New England history. I've actually, as it happens, just started a playlist with all of my King Philip's War videos in chronological order, so that might be of interest to you. I've also been known to dress up as a witch hunter and accost people in the streets of Salem from time to time.
King Philip's War ended with a repeat of Mystic Fort known as the Great Swamp Fight. They surrounded a Narragansett village, set it on fire, and shot anyone who attempted to escape. Hundreds were killed. You should really watch his video about this. I can't do it justice here. Links to everything will be in the description. On August 12, 1676, Metacom was killed. The Plymouth colonists quartered him and sent his arms and legs to different parts of New England, but kept his head on a spike in the middle of town for the next 20 years. 5 days later, they held a day of go-to-church Thanksgiving. Just to reiterate that, after butchering a man, cutting off his head, and mounting it in the middle of town for all to see, they celebrated. Like I said, these are medieval people. In 1691, Plymouth was officially absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the Puritan movement in America began to crumble after the public relations disaster that was the Salem witch trials, when they burned innocent women at the stake. There, done. I debunked the story of Thanksgiving in less than an hour. Bet you didn't think that was possible. Oh no.
How did this event, which happened almost 400 years ago, become a part of the American story and our oldest national tradition?
Okay, are you like a person? You aren't just showing me random clips. These are intentional. Nothing? Fine. To explain—
Hi, KB Morgan here from KB Morgan's Gold Pond Check Cashing Rent Center and Payday Loans. But today, I'm here to talk to you about the Knowing Better merch store. We're going to be launching some new and exciting products in 2023, but first, everything we currently have in stock must go. That's right, it's a Knowing Better liquidation sale. From now until the end of January, enter KB 2023 at checkout to receive 20% off your order. We've got shirts, stickers, and my personal favorite, enamel pins. I don't know about you guys, but I've been collecting pins from all of my favorite creators, and I've got to complete the set. We've also got these notebooks that KB uses literally every day. Look at these color-coded notes. What a nerd! Get yours while supplies last!
I want to be mad at him for that, but he's a damn good salesman. KB 2023 at checkout. William Bradford's journal, The Definitive First-Hand History of Plymouth Colony, had been handed down generation to generation until it ended up in the Old South Church in Boston. During the Revolutionary War, the British briefly took control of the city and Bradford's manuscript was lost. When the war was won and America had gained its independence, George Washington proclaimed a day of national thanksgiving to take place on November 26, 1789. He announced another one following the successful suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion on February 19, 1795. James Madison issued a similar proclamation following the end of the War of 1812 to take place on April 13, 1815. None of these three included turkey or a feast. You were still supposed to spend the day in contemplative prayer. After that, there were no Thanksgivings, at least not nationally. Individual states continued to declare them whenever, but it wasn't a specific day on the calendar. But then, in 1841, Alexander Young published Edward Winslow's papers, including that December 11th letter, which described the fall harvest feast in 4 sentences. However, he didn't just publish the letters on their own. He included his own commentary. The footnote for this paragraph states,
"This was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England. On this occasion, they no doubt feasted on wild turkey, as well as venison."
That's it. That's the reason why everyone says the Pilgrims held the first Thanksgiving. That one footnote that unilaterally declared the day to be something more significant than it actually was. But the person most often credited with transforming the solemn Pilgrim Thanksgiving into the modern family feast we have today is a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale, who is the editor of Goody's Ladies Book.
As the influential editor of one of the most popular periodicals of the 19th century, year after year she wrote columns making the case for the holiday. She published fiction and poems with a Thanksgiving Day theme, and she offered her readers recipes for traditional Thanksgiving dishes, such as roast turkey and pumpkin pie.
Her version of the holiday began to catch on with the public, and several states made it a habit of declaring certain days to be Thanksgiving, but they weren't consistent. One state might have it in November, another in December. So in 1847, she began urging her readers to write letters to politicians in the hopes of establishing a single, unified Thanksgiving that the entire nation would celebrate together. In 1855, William Bradford's journal was discovered in the library of the Bishop of London. A copy was made, and the History of Plymouth Plantation was published the very next year. Just 5 years before the Civil War, this book kicked off a cultural pilgrim craze across the country, on par with Pokemon or Marvel superheroes today.
Presidents Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, and Franklin Pierce, to whom she had written letters, showed little interest in her cause, but Lincoln saw its potential. His proclamation was the first in what became an unbroken string of annual Thanksgiving proclamations by every subsequent president. In the autumn of 1863, at the height of the Civil War, when Americans were bitterly divided, Abraham Lincoln nevertheless called for a day of national Thanksgiving.
That's how every version of this story goes. Sarah Josepha Hale writes Lincoln a letter, and he declares Thanksgiving to be a national holiday. If you Google, when did Lincoln declare the first Thanksgiving? The answer you get is October 1863. PragerU is not the only source to say that. It's everywhere. So now I'm going to tell you why I think that story is made up. Sarah Josepha Hale wrote her letter to Lincoln on September 28, 1863, and Lincoln issued his proclamation for Thanksgiving Day on October 3, 1863. You're telling me that during the height of the Civil War, a letter made it to the White House in under 5 days? Even if it did, presidential proclamations aren't the kinds of things that are written and delivered in a day. This was prepared days, if not weeks in advance. And to top it all off, this wasn't Lincoln's first Thanksgiving proclamation. It was his third. The first was on April 13, 1862, to celebrate Grant's victory at Shiloh. The second was on August 6, 1863, to celebrate the victory at Gettysburg. The one that Hale gets credit for was issued just 2 months later. We had 2 Thanksgivings in the fall of 1863, and we only ever talk about the second one. Now, PragerU is correct when they say that this was the first in an unbroken string of late fall Thanksgivings, but it still wasn't a national holiday. It had to be re-declared every year by the president. When Andrew Johnson assumed the office, he moved Thanksgiving to the first Thursday in December. If Sarah Josepha Hale was successful in making Thanksgiving a national holiday in 1863, someone really should have let her know, because she continued her letter writing campaign for another decade and a half. The only political body in the country that could make Thanksgiving a permanent federal holiday was Congress, who just established Christmas as a federal holiday, so That's who she directed her efforts towards. Sarah Josepha Hale died in 1879. The holiday continued to be renewed annually by each president until 1941, when Congress and FDR finally made Thanksgiving a federal holiday and pegged it to the fourth Thursday in November. So, why does everyone say Sarah Josepha Hale is responsible for pressuring Lincoln into declaring Thanksgiving a national holiday? Because the truth is boring. Crediting a female magazine editor's decades-long letter-writing campaign in the mid-1800s makes for a better story. People love stories, and what holiday has a better story than Thanksgiving? Nowadays, both the 4th of July and Thanksgiving are celebrated as America's beginning. It's much less about giving thanks and more about reminding ourselves that we live in the greatest country in the world.
But Thanksgiving is about more than tasty food, said Dennis. It's a special day set aside to give thanks and remember everything we're grateful for, especially for being American.
All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it.
Here's a suggestion. At this year's Thanksgiving table, ask everyone to spend a minute to say what they are grateful for. I suspect you'll find your guests will have a long and eloquent list, and if they don't, you can help them out. Suggest they start with family, friends, and living in the freest country in the world.
Given that framing, it's no wonder why some people, especially American Indians, view Thanksgiving as a day of mourning.
Back in 2007, Seattle public school officials made national news by describing the holiday as a time of mourning and a bitter reminder of 500 years of betrayal. This new narrative describes the Pilgrims as arrogant oppressors who...
Hold up there, bud. This is not a new narrative. Not even close. In 1836, William Apis wrote a book titled Eulogy on King Philip, where he stated,
"We say, therefore, let every man of color wrap himself in mourning. For the 22nd of December and the 4th of July are days of mourning and not of joy. The prayers, preaching, and examples of those pretended pious has been the foundation of all the slavery and degradation in the American colonies toward colored people."
December 22nd was the day the Pilgrims landed at Patuxent. Thanksgiving wasn't a thing in the 1830s, otherwise I'm sure he would have chosen that day instead. By 1970, it was a full-blown federal holiday, so a man named Frank James organized the first National Day of Mourning. It was soon hijacked by the American Indian movement, who stormed the Mayflower 2 replica and buried Plymouth Rock under sand, which was somewhat of a distraction from the original message. The point is, this mournful view of Thanksgiving is well over a century old. It's not a new narrative thought up by a Seattle public school. PragerU wants people to think that the controversy surrounding Thanksgiving and even Columbus Day are recent phenomena, which somehow makes it easier to brush off and ignore. When PragerU, politicians, and parents say that they want to bring back patriotic education, they're talking about the sanitized version of American history, which invariably begins with the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving. I am not against the holiday of Thanksgiving. There's nothing wrong with getting together with friends and family to eat a bunch of food, watch football, and pray, if that's what you're into. I'm against the fairy tale we tell ourselves, which has transformed Thanksgiving into a uniquely American holiday, which serves as a nationalistic reminder of our freedoms and Christian roots. This fantasy was invented out of whole cloth in the mid-1800s and continued to evolve through the turn of the century, when a lot of our history was simply made up. This period is typically referred to as the Victorian Age, and it's when George Washington cut down the cherry tree, Columbus proved the world was round, Vikings began wearing horned helmets, and the Pilgrims had buckles on their hats. This is also when Santa got fat, started wearing red, and moved to the North Pole. A lot of our holiday traditions and narratives were developed during this time. Prior to the Civil War, the North and South had separate creation myths, with Plymouth and Jamestown competing over which one gets the title of the true founding moment for the United States. During Reconstruction, Jamestown faded into obscurity, and the legend of the Mayflower and the first Thanksgiving became the dominant story. The helpful, welcoming Indians weren't added to the narrative until the 1890s, when the wars were over and they were all living on reservations. Americans simply couldn't accept them as being friendly until they had been defeated. Now, You may be asking yourself why the South would be so willing to abandon their own mythology for one that originated in the North. And the answer to that question is that the Victorian Age in England was the post-Reconstruction era in the United States. The South was more than happy to switch to a narrative that does not include slavery. The Pilgrim story was invented and adopted at the same time as the Lost Cause. In fact, it's the first chapter of the Lost Cause. The focus on Plymouth as our national origin is one of the weirdest cases of survivorship bias I've ever seen. It wasn't the first English colony in North America. It wasn't even the second. If we're only counting major attempts, it was the fourth. And that first Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims and Wampanoags wasn't the first to take place in North America. The Spanish and French beat them by decades. Only a third of the passengers on the Mayflower were persecuted saints looking to worship God in their own way. Everyone else was coming to the New World for the same reason that Jamestown was founded: to make money. But we focus on the Pilgrims because it replaces the capitalist, racist, expansionist origin of America with a pious Christian one based on individual liberty and freedom, where we make friends with the natives. Just don't think about what happened immediately afterwards. The tale of the Pilgrims lays the groundwork for a very religious telling of American history that has wormed its way into every classroom. We were founded on divine providence to manifest our destiny to become a Christian nation, founded on Judeo-Christian values and a Protestant work ethic. Honestly, the legend of the Mayflower sounds more like the founding myth of Gilead than the United States. And I think that's the point. That's why it's really only Republicans and evangelicals who want to make sure that this myth is the only version taught in school. But this isn't just targeted at the next generation. There's a reason why PragerU makes videos about Thanksgiving and every sitcom does an episode on it. And that's because you can vote. You can show up at school board meetings and yell, "That's not the version I was taught, stop indoctrinating our kids!" Continuing to spread this false narrative about a holiday allows us to lie to ourselves about who we are as a country. We were not always nice to people of color. We didn't always have the best intentions. And we certainly aren't as devout as those original Pilgrims. While Puritanism might have faded away, their various spin-offs remain. Today, we refer to any church that adheres to their interpretation of the Bible as a cult. Think about that the next time you sit down with your family to celebrate Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, or any holiday, really, because now you know better. Hey everyone, I just want to thank you all for making this a great year. I really enjoyed working on this Jamestown project, so I hope you all did too. I'm going to take a little bit of time off in January, but Twitch streams and work on the next video will pick up after that. There's no way I can maintain this as my full-time job without your support, and every little bit counts. So here's a list of every patron who supports the channel. If you'd like to add your name to this list of religious dissidents, head on over to patreon.com/knowingbetter, or for a one-time donation, paypal.me/knowingbetter. Don't forget to feast on that subscribe button or the join button if you're a full-blown Puritan. Check out the merch at knowingbetter.tv, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and join us on the subreddit.